You know those college workbooks, right? Full of definitions, maybe some diagrams, pretty standard stuff. But what if a workbook for a class as serious as constitutional law took you on a journey you absolutely did not see coming? Well, today, we're diving into one that does exactly that, transforming simple exercises into a really profound look at law, power, and society. So the whole journey kicks off with a question that seems super simple. What does a constitutional lawyer actually do? It's a familiar, easy entry point, exactly the kind of thing you'd expect to see right on page one. And the answer, at first, is just as simple. They read a lot. But right when you're getting comfortable, the workbook throws its first real curveball. It basically says, hey, if you really want to understand the Constitution, you've got to read about what's happening way outside the courtroom. And this is where the workbook's whole unique flow really starts to show itself. It just takes this sharp, unexpected turn. We pivot away from thinking about the day-to-day work of one lawyer, and suddenly we're looking at these huge, complex systems that shape all of our lives. Yeah, instead of digging into old, dusty legal books, this workbook yanks us right into the present day. It focuses our attention on two of the most powerful and polarizing social movements out there, both making claims on the streets: the January 6th insurrectionists and the Black Lives Matter movement. What's really interesting here is how the workbook sets these two groups up. It's not about picking a side at all. Instead, it presents their core arguments as these competing stories. On one side, you have January 6th supporters who feel their rights are being trampled. On the other, you have the Black Lives Matter movement, arguing that the system itself has created deep inequality. The workbook points out that both groups are using evidence, they're using personal experience, and yet they seem to be talking completely past each other. And that becomes the central puzzle for the law student to figure out. So that brings us to the million-dollar question, right? The one you're probably asking yourself right now. How in the world does a workbook connect these intense modern-day conflicts back to something as old and established as constitutional law? Well, to build that bridge, the workbook introduces a pretty big academic idea. It's a framework designed to help analyze these competing claims, the theory of racial capitalism. Now, the workbook is super careful here. It defines racial capitalism not as some opinion or political ideology, but as a tool for analysis. It's presented as a factual description of how our economic system, as it grew, became tangled up with racial hierarchies, embedding those ideas deep into our social and legal DNA. To stop this from being just a lofty abstract theory, the workbook immediately grounds it in some key moments from U.S. history. It starts way back in 1787, pointing to language in the Constitution itself that protected what James Madison called the unequal faculties for acquiring property. Then it walks us through time, the 1808 ban on importing slaves, which left domestic slavery totally intact, and then the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. It's building a case, piece by piece. And here is the bottom line, according to the workbook. It argues that these foundational decisions set up a system with a fundamentally unfair distribution of wealth and power. A legacy, it says, that's been passed down for over 300 years, and one that is shaping the exact conflicts we see playing out on the streets today. Okay, so after laying out this massive historical and theoretical framework, the workbook does something pretty amazing to make it all feel real. It zooms from that huge bird's-eye view of history all the way down to the story of a single person. We meet a student named X. We learn that X is a community college student who is also homeless. This one personal story becomes the case study for seeing how all these huge systemic forces actually play out in one person's life. And the story is just raw. This quote right here from X's run-in with the police takes all that abstract theory and makes it incredibly, painfully real. Suddenly, it's not about systems anymore. It's about what it feels like to be frisked, judged, and profiled on a city street. But just when we're lost in X's personal story, the workbook pulls the camera lens way back out again. It shows us this isn't just one person's bad luck. It hits us with a pretty shocking statistic. Nearly half of all college students in the U.S. struggle with housing. X's story, it turns out, represents a huge, widespread crisis. So, X's journey becomes this perfect example of what academics call intersectionality. See, it's never just one issue. The workbook shows how housing discrimination, bias policing, and exploitation at work all crash into each other, creating this tangled web of problems that is almost impossible for one person to break out of. All right, so the workbook has given us a big theory, and it's given us a powerful human story. The next logical step in its flow is to give the student the actual academic tools to analyze everything they've just learned. This isn't just about making you feel something, it's about building real, critical understanding. One of these tools is an idea called the strict father model. The workbook explains how major institutions, think family, school, have often been built on this kind of top-down patriarchal model. And that, in turn, shapes what our whole society thinks of as normal or traditional, which often just reinforces the way things already are. Another key tool comes from the sociologist Susan Silby. As you can see in this graphic from the workbook, she discovered that people tend to relate to the law in one of three main ways. You can stand before the law, seeing it as this majestic, almost sacred system. You can be with the law, treating it more like a game to be played and won. Or you can resist the law because you experience it as an oppressive force. So, as we start to pull all these pieces together, the big theory, the personal case study, these analytical tools, the workbook guides us to its final destination. And it's a really complex, challenging view on the nature of law itself. And that brings us right to the workbook's stated learning outcomes. So what are you supposed to walk away with? First, that legal stories focused on property can end up pushing people out. Second, that homelessness isn't just one thing. It's a collision of racial capitalism, gentrification, displacement, and criminalization. And finally, the big one, that the law itself is a double-edged sword. It's a tool that can be used for domination, but it also sparks resistance. In the end, the workbook leaves the student wrestling with this powerful, unresolved tension. It totally pushes past any simple answers and just leaves you with this final, really provocative question. If the law really is a double-edged sword, is it a tool for justice, a game to be won, or a system you have to resist? The workbook doesn't give you the answer. And, maybe that's the most important lesson of all.